Now, you mentioned this sort of drag going from something inherently frivolous to sort of a vehicle for authenticity. That this is now a sincere expression of my identity in some way. And this brings us to the relationship between drag and what's often been called the therapeutic culture. So, what is the therapeutic culture, and how is it related to drag?
So I spent a lot of time in recent years thinking about and writing about therapeutic culture and the therapeutic. So to make it real brief, for the purposes of this podcast, I think there are three core therapeutic values, right? So the first one is individuality, that I am not just an individual, right? I'm a distinct person, which we might say, well, that's kind of rooted in liberalism, which goes back centuries, or you might even say it's rooted in Christianity. And so it's a little bit different, right? It's not that I am an individual and therefore individualness is of value, but individuality is. And this is, I think, fundamentally romantic. And so it comes up in the 19th century that I
Hmm.
am a distinct person who has his own distinct genius, shall we say, and my own understanding of the world and my own stamp to put on the world. And so it is that kind of feature of individuality, I think, that I am this kind of unique and creative spirit in the world. There's nobody like me. So that's one. A second therapeutic value is authenticity. That what is of signal importance is that this very unique, special, individual person that I am needs to kind of get out. It needs to be expressed. I need to be my true self. I mean, we hear this kind of language all the time in America, and usually, right, has nothing to do with things like drag and whatnot. So I need to be my true self, and anything that allows me to be my true self is therefore good, and anything that oppresses my true self is therefore bad. So that's the second. The third is liberation. That therefore the whole society needs to be reconstructed so that true selves can express themselves. And so, usually, I think in our contemporary society in America in the early 21st century, we see this as coded as love, right? Love is love. Let everybody be who they are. And if you're not letting somebody be who he or she truly is, then you're the bad person. And you need to stop doing what you do. And we need to change all institutions so that everyone can express their true self. And therefore, somehow we'll all just kind of spontaneously associate with one another. And this will be some form of salvation, or I think a substitute for salvation. And we will have a society ruled by love, and we will have a society that all true selves are realized.
This is obviously the therapeutic culture. I mean, bringing in the theme of femininity again. I think that pretty much everybody in America, I mean, is infected by this to some degree. Very much including, Orthodox Catholics. The therapeutic mindset is still very prevalent because it's
Absolutely.
like the air we breathe. But it is true that there are some distinctly feminine aspects of the therapeutic culture, and I want to be careful when I say that, because I'm not trying to use feminine as a pejorative, but what I mean is that there are aspects of it that seem particularly to appeal to women, and sort of dynamics by which it tends to make to try to get men to behave or think or express themselves in more typically feminine ways. So I'm not pathologizing all of these aspects of femininity in themselves, but it's more like an exaggerated emphasis on them, or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, I see. I see what you mean, and I think there is something there, right? I mean, this is what's at the heart of my observations in this article. This is something that I have been thinking about for a while, and quite frankly, have been very reticent to say anything publicly about it because it's it can be a difficult kind of subject to talk about in careful ways, and I think it should be talked about carefully. Um, let me say it this way. the whole notion of the therapeutic begins with a man, right? Sigmund Freud, and his notion of repression and his understanding of how much of our psychic suffering and emotional suffering comes from repression. And therefore, at least for Freud, right, what needed to happen is that the individual needed to kind of reconcile himself to the demands of society, and therefore to work through, right, through therapeutic practices, lots of the reasons for this psychic suffering. But it didn't entail a wholesale transformation of the whole society, right? That was not the original therapeutic project. And so we get the field of psychiatry, which is invented around this time in the early 20th century. And this is its purpose, right? To engage in these therapeutic practices to alleviate psychic, I guess one might say, suffering. But over time, the field of psychiatry and psychology has become increasingly female. And the data is just overwhelmingly obvious in this way. So the two pieces of data that I'll offer to your listeners are these. In the United States today, about, I think it is about 2/3 of people, of Americans, adult Americans, who sought any kind of psychiatric services in the most recent year, which data is available, which I believe is 2019, were women. So about 2/3 of them were women, therefore about 1/3 of them were men. It's not to say that men don't go to therapy, they do, but you can just see from the data that seeking of psychological services is predominantly, although not wholly, female. The other is who are the practitioners of psychiatry and psychology. And these, again, are overwhelmingly women. And I have the number in my article. I don't know if I can find it off the top of my head or find it in the article, remember it. But I think it's somewhere over 70%, and it might be more kind of 75, 80% of mental health practitioners are female. And this is only becoming more so over time. You can even find articles that discuss how there are hardly any men anymore, especially once you get to younger ages, say men under 40. They're almost non-existent in psychology and psychiatry. So this is the kind of empirical core, if you will. But there are other kinds of fields that are, I think, quite therapeutic in our society and that are also very female. So for example, social work and counseling, very female fields in the United States. We can also look at libraries. I mean, you had mentioned earlier, right, the drag queen story hour phenomenon. I think something like 80% of librarians in America are women. And so who is it that's inviting drag queens into public libraries in America? It's mostly, not wholly, but it's mostly women. And so I think you can see that if you look at particular kinds of professions and particular social spaces in America that are very animated by a therapeutic sensibility, a therapeutic culture, these also are fields that tend to be predominantly female.
And now we're not just talking about women in general, right? So isn't there some specific data, some rather startling data about liberal women specifically with regard to therapy?
Right. So these data they're difficult to parse, right? But you can find data pretty easily in surveys that show that liberal women seek out psychological services at far higher rates than anyone else in the society. So it's a feature of not just one's sex, but it's also a feature of one's political ideology. So it is true that conservative women seek out, for example, psychological services more often than men do. That being said, women also just go to the doctor, a regular doctor, shall we say, more often than men do.
Right.
But again, I think this is still an important phenomenon that women are seeking certain kinds of kind of professional interventions for wellness, for lack of a better term, more so than men do. But it's also, it has an ideological phenomenon. Liberals do this much more so than conservatives. And so therefore, when you put the categories together, and it's shown in the data, liberal women are particularly prevalent in not just receiving psychological services, but even claiming to have been diagnosed with any
Right.
kind of psychological malady or illness.